Hi, I'm Kimberly Jolly from Fat Quarter Shop, and we're on our final leg. What the heck? Final installment. Okay. Hey guys, I'm Kimberly from Fat Quarter Shop, and we're on week 4 of the 2021 Mystery Bats and Booze quilt. If you've missed our previous weeks, just go to Fat Quarter Shop and download the free patterns and check out all our videos. This week, what we're going to focus on is putting all the blocks together. We have our final reveal for our free cross-stitch version of Bats and Booze. Make sure to download that free pattern also at Fat Quarter Shop. So let's jump into it. For week 4, you just need to cut your border fabric and your binding fabric. Now we have a lot of videos on binding. I'm going to put a playlist below where you can cut all your binding from that video and check out all my tips on that. Today I'm just going to cut the outer border, and this one, luckily, we don't have to piece anything. It fits with the width of fabric. My tip for you on cutting borders is to always have a really nice fold right here. You want it to be nice and straight, and you will take your Creative Grids ruler and put the line right on that fold and cut. Now I'm going to cut all 4 of these separately just so that they are nice and accurate. Now here what I'm going to do is just rotate without trying to move it too much. And these borders are cut 4.5 inches wide. So I will just put the 4.5 inch line on my ruler on that and cut 4 times. Now, after I keep going, I do want to make sure that that fold at the top is still aligning with the ruler. And you can see it is, because if you look at the top, it's straight across. So those are your outer borders. We're going to set those aside and line up all of our blocks and start pinning to do the final assembly. For your quilt center, you're going to put the bats on the corner, the pumpkins around, and the star in the center. So I'm just going to lay out all of my blocks. Now to assemble, the first thing we're going to do is sew down this seam. So I will put that right sides together, and I'll show you how to pin. Some people don't pin, but I would say when you get to quilt assembly, you have to pin. If you don't, you're gonna have a lot of wobbly stuff going on. So if you're not a pinner, just try at least when you get to the assembly. So I pinned top and bottom like I always do, and then I'm gonna put a couple of pins in, and luckily this is matching really nice. Sometimes I do have to pull a little bit to make it fit, but that's not. So I'll put that on the top, put this one together, right side. Oh my goodness, look, this block is a little bit bigger than my pumpkin block. And that is okay, that happens. Actually, that one has a center seam, so we'll just line those up to make it easy. And the rest, you just work it in. Just put a pin in each of these. So the more off your blocks are, the more pins you put in, and it's gonna work out. You'll never know that it's different. So even though we tried to be as accurate as possible, they're different blocks and they just come out different. And on the last one, we'll do the same thing. So here what I'm going to do is going to be a little bit different than when I assembled the blocks. I'm going to sew each of these with a 1/4 inch seam, but I'm not going to keep the chain in between the blocks because that will become too much weight at the back of my sewing machine. So I'm going to stitch, cut the seam, stitch, cut the seam, and stitch. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch foot. So let's go to the sewing machine. At this step, I am going to press toward the pumpkin block. So I'm going to set my seam, press that nice and flat. And you'll notice before I left the sewing machine, I didn't make sure any of my points matched, because when I start assembling a quilt, I stop paying attention to that because that becomes way too much unpicking. So I'm less picky when I get to this part. I don't even look before I go press. See, one little point is a little bit chopped off. I'm not undoing that. Nobody is going to notice, and just keep going. Now we will lay our blocks back out just like we had them. We'll add that third row. We're gonna do the same thing where I pin and then go to the sewing machine and just sew them and cut them apart each time. One tip I can give you is if on the back where this is pressed open, if you put a pin right where that seam is, it's less likely to flip over. So you can pin right there and it's less likely to distort on the bottom. So you can see I pinned each of those where it's pressed open on the back. So we're going to pin first at the end, then at the intersections, and then throughout. I'm going to set my seam and then press towards the top and bottom rows because there are less seams there. And on rows and putting blocks together, you get a lot of bulk, so I do tend to finger press it before I start. I'm just going to add my bottom row. And again, just making sure my cobwebs touch the center. So for my borders, I do things a little bit different. Some people measure the center of the quilt and come up with their border size that way. I never do that. I just take exactly what the pattern tells me. And on this one, we're gonna add 32.5-inch strips to the side. So I'm gonna measure what the center of 32.5 is. And that should be 16.25. And then 40.5 is 20.25. And I'm gonna write that on my pattern so it's easy for me to remember. So now I'm going to take my borders and I'm going to mark them. So first, lay out the first one. 16.25 on my mat is right here. And 16.25 is right here. So I pin right there. I do not cut my borders down. I attach them and then chop them off. Then I mark my center. Now if you take this and open it up, it should measure 32.5. So do the same thing on the second one, mark at 16.25 and the center. And this is the only time I ever use my mat for measurements is when I'm doing borders. So those are going to be the left and right borders. Now the top and bottom borders are 20.25, same thing. And I do always kind of write it out because I don't want to have to redo the math a million times. So 20.25 is here and here and the center. And that's why I love our patterns, because we always list out the borders. Patterns that don't list the size of the borders really get on my nerves, because I just want someone to tell me the size. I don't want to have to do it because of the way that I do my borders, because I don't average. Some people will measure and take the average. I don't ever do that. So these are the top and bottom, and I've got them all marked. When you look at this quilt, you can rotate it and there really isn't a top and bottom or a side. So I'm just going to pick a side to add the left and the right. What I will do is find the center, put a pin in the center, do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to pin both of these at the same time because it's a smaller quilt. If it was a larger quilt, I would probably do them one at a time. So I've got the center right here and here. So I pin right here, put the edge of that pin, do the other side, pin, match up these centers, and pin. And now you can see it's going to be a little bit wavy. And then what do? Pop it, just start pinning. And that'll ease it all in. And so here, same thing, stretch it and just start pinning. So I've got that side done. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch down each one with a 1/4 inch seam, but when I add borders I do back stitch at the front and the back, and I leave the border piece on top when I'm stitching. Now from here I will set my seam, press toward the border on both sides. So it's easiest to press toward the border because there's no seams towards the border. So if you had to press inside towards the quilt, you would be fighting a lot of seams. So I always press to my borders. I never press to the inside. Now I'm going to chop off my borders before I add the last 2 borders. And what I do is take a Creative Grids ruler and I'm going to line up the line where the border is, and see how this is going underneath? You just pull it and cut straight. And I'm going to do all 4 sides the same exact way. As your quilts get bigger and bigger, sometimes your borders become a little bit wavy, and if they do, I would just start trimming up here also. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing that we just did. Find the center, pin the borders, attach, and press toward the border. So I'm going to do the same thing where I line up the line here, across here, so our quilt finishes at 40.5 by 40.5. And for my backing, I like to add 5 inches to each side. So that would be 10 inches and 10 inches. So 40.5 plus 10 inches is 50.5 by 50.5. I have this piece of fabric that is 2 7/8 yards, and 2 7/8 divided by 2 will give you 2 50-inch pieces. I've already ironed it. If I cut this in half, this is 2 50-inch pieces. It doesn't have to be straight. I'm going to show you how to sew them together and then how to trim them down. But what I like to do a backing is a little bit different than what most people do. I'm going to hold these 2 salvages together and pull the rest away and fold. And so I've got a 50-inch piece on top of a 50-inch piece, and I've got all of this bulk out of the way. and I'm just going to cut a little bit of the salvage off. I don't want any of that salvage on here. So when I cut, I'm going to take the fold here and put it on my Creative Grids ruler, because you want to be straight across the fold, not against the salvage. And then I'm just going to pull my ruler down and keep that line going that I've already started and trim. Okay, so now here I'm going to pin before I go to my machine, and I'm just going to, there's a layer here and a layer here. So I'm going to pin all across so that it stays together when I go to my machine. Now the traditional way to sew a backing is to use a 1/2 inch seam and press open. I didn't know that when I learned, so I've always done a 1/4 inch seam and press to one side. So that's what I'm going to do today. So that gives you two options, the traditional way or the Kimberly way. And I am going to use that same gray Aurifil 2600 on this fabric, because if you use black, your black is going to show through on those white ghosts. So we're going to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew all the way across, 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to sew super fast. So I have it sewed. I'm going to fold it twice where that stitch is. I'm going to set my seams, and I'm going to just press to one side. And I do use steam, and I did starch this fabric, so it has pre-shrunk because I starched. And you can see, even though I use that gray, light gray thread, the thread is not showing on the back. So when you're looking at your piece, this part is 50 inches and this part is 80. So you can send this to your quilter like this, and they can trim it down, or you can trim it down for them. And I like my seam to be in the center, but it really doesn't matter. So I'm actually going to this time just cut where the seam is closer to the bottom. I'm going to use the line on my cutting mat, and then this right here is 50 inches on the 20-inch mark. So I'm actually going to cut it a little bit past that, and I just cut a little piece off. And then you have this big piece that's all one piece that you can save for something else. So now you're ready, you can send this to your quilter, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to add a label to it. I'm going to do the label where it goes on the top of the backing. So I buy these labels from Sweetwater Label Company. This will actually iron directly on, so you can do that, but I don't really want this raw edge, so I'm going to take some of this leftover backing, sew it around, and show you how to stitch this down on the backing, so if your quilt is ever stolen, your name is in the quilt. So this is my leftover backing, and I'm just going to make a little border around this. So I'm just going to cut a couple of strips that are just 2 inches wide, and they're just random sizes. I don't measure anything for this, and you'll see what I mean in a little bit. It doesn't have to be exact. Just something that I'm going to be able to fold under later to attach it to my quilt. So I've got some strips. Now this label from Sweetwater has a sticky residue to the back. So I'm going to take just a random white fabric that's left over from another project and iron this down. So I just put that on there, and the instructions say to let it sit for about 10 seconds. And I've got this white on here so I can sew it in. And if I sewed it in without putting this white on the back, it would gum up your iron. Now I'm just going to cut around. This label does have dotted lines around it, so I am cutting about 3/8 of an inch away, so that I don't, when I add the border, I don't cut into that little dotted line, since that's part of the design. Now from here, I'm going to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam and this with a 1/4 inch seam, and press open. So I press toward my fabric away from my label, and I'm just going to trim this off. And by doing my labels this way, I don't really have to do math. I just kind of do whatever, and I'll trim it down and show you. And this is a little bit long, so I'll take that off. Now you will take your other loose pieces, just some scraps, and we're gonna stitch those to the top and bottom, and you can see it's just overlapping. I just want to have a little bit around my border so I can turn my edges under and stitch it down. So I'm going to just measure 1.5 inches away from the seam. That's just a random size that I came up with. It's kind of the size that I use most when I'm doing this. So just 1.5 inches away. And then it'll make it, you know, a nice rectangle size. And of course, this is a label, so you can do whatever you want. You can have fun, you can make it big, skinny, fat, whatever you want. Now from here, I want to turn my edges under like this on all 4 sides, pin it to the back, and it will blend in and it will sew in. So to do that, I have a tip for you. So I like to use this Hot Hammer by Clover. It is a ruler that you can iron on. So that's about 1/4 inch. I don't use it for measurements, I just use it for the stability. So I just iron that down, and it's the perfect tool to get that crease just nice and straight. So I just go all the way around, arbitrarily about 1/4 inch. You can do 1/2 inch, you can do whatever you want. And it's just gonna create this really nice edge. So then I turn it to the other side, just press it nice and flat. And when we get to the corners, we'll make them work, and I'll show you how to do that. I'm not gonna do that until we get to the sewing machine. Your label needs to be at least 5 inches from this corner and 5 inches from this corner, because this is what's gonna get chopped off in the back. But I don't wanna do it too close. So I'm gonna go in even more. I'm gonna go to right here, and I'm gonna put the label right here. I am gonna try to make it straight, and I will just use pins to hold it in place. Now, I'm gonna use an open toe foot, and I'm gonna use a stitch length that's like a 3.0, just so I have a nice, you know, fatter stitch. And I'm just gonna stitch on all 4 sides about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, and I'll probably start at the bottom, go all the way around, and as I get to a corner, you're gonna see me use these pins and just fiddle with it before it goes down. So I'm gonna use my open toe foot where I put the edge of the center of the foot on the edge of the label and use that as a guide. And I will make 2 stitches, back stitch so that it stays in place. And if you have a fancy machine, you can do a tack stitch. And I'm just going all the way around. And when I get here, this little ear is kind of sticking out, so I'll just poke it in with my pin. Keep my needle down, rotate, go all the way around. I'm gonna sew slightly over my previous stitches and back stitch. And we have this nice label for the back of our quilt. Thanks for watching our 2021 Mystery Bats and Booze quilt along. We hope you've enjoyed this free pattern, and you can look forward to more free patterns from Fat Quarter Shop soon. See you next time.